All right, so we're going to be talking about public opinion and the role that it plays in constitutional democracies, such as the United States of America. Turns out public opinion also matters in autocracies, in places like Russia and China. It doesn't play as central a role in their politics for obvious reasons, but even in those situations, public opinion does make some difference to politics. Right, but in a constitutional democracy, we would expect public opinion to play an absolutely central role, and it does. I thought our text did a really good job of laying out some really good examples of how previous elected leaders have taken public opinion into account in a variety of ways. The Founding Fathers, right? They had created in Philadelphia this thing called a Constitution, and then their job became, right, to sell it to the American people to get 9 out of the 13 states to ratify it. So what did they do? They hired Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison to issue a series of newspaper articles or editorials promoting ratification, right? The Federalist Papers. That was maybe one of our very earliest examples of elected leaders trying to move public opinion, right, to support ratification of the Constitution. Lincoln, our authors point out, sought to influence public opinion on the Civil War, right? Because over the course of that war, it became increasingly apparent that central to that war effort had to be the abolition of slavery. Right? So he sought to frame the Civil War increasingly in that context. It's a war about and over the abolition of slavery, with things like the Gettysburg Address. John F. Kennedy, although he had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the civil rights table, as we've discussed, he also, right, eventually came to see that public opinion was lagging a bit on a civil rights agenda, and at the very least to restore peace in the streets, right, as the black civil rights movement picked up momentum and the white South fought back with increasing violence. He recognized that, you know, we need to get ahead of this thing and move forward on civil rights. We can't keep dragging our feet. And in order to address this, right, you got to start to build public support for major civil rights legislation. So towards the end of his presidency, cut short obviously by his assassination, he sought to move public opinion in favor of major civil rights legislation. LBJ, who took that torch, right, and carried it quite admirably in terms of getting public support for the Civil Rights Act of '64 and then the Voting Rights Act of '65. LBJ, right, won that battle over public opinion and went on national television to shape it. But he lost the battle for public opinion regarding the Vietnam War, right? That was always the albatross around his neck, was the war in Vietnam, which he Americanized with aggression under his leadership. I think at one point we had something like over 500,000 troops over in Vietnam. And so he tried to argue, right, to the American people that things were going great, that we're winning. I mean, well, it turns out we weren't winning. We weren't winning at all, and the media became increasingly critical of that narrative coming out of the White House that we were winning, not winning, in fact, losing. And so he lost that battle for public opinion on the war. That ultimately later forced our withdrawal from that effort, and it seems to have triggered LBJ's decision not to run for another term. He had become so unpopular because of that war. And then related to that, right, George W. Bush initially convinced the public that invading Iraq was a great idea post 9/11, although the connections, right, between Iraq and 9/11 were pretty sketchy. There's a longer story to be told there. I won't tell it here. But initially, right, we supported that effort. But over time, right, as it became increasingly apparent that although we had won a military victory over Iraq, that wasn't really what we were seeking, right? We were seeking regime change and establishing Iraq as a constitutional democracy so that it would no longer be a haven for terrorism. And in that, right, we failed terribly, as we had to. Right? No matter how powerful America's military is, right, you can't force another country to be something that they're not ready for. Right? So that became an increasingly lost cause in Iraq. And as a result, right, the public began to turn against it. And George W. Bush barely got reelected in 2004. And by 2005, his approval ratings were in the gutter. And he got very little done in his second term as president because he had lost the battle for public opinion specific to the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. But, W. Bush recognized that if I lose the public on this, my presidency is in trouble, and he was correct. All right, so what are some of the factors that shape public opinion? I think these are all intuitively obvious in a way, but we still need to talk about them in an analytically rigorous way. One's family, right, first and foremost, arguably. And specifically, typically, one's parents. One's parents will often have a very large impact on one's public opinion. Right? And these days especially, I think Democrats tend to marry other Democrats, Republicans tend to marry other Republicans. So typically, kids are getting a pretty unified message on politics. Or it's a one-parent household, and you're going to get a unified message by definition. But we tend to inherit, really, almost genetically, but not really, of course, socially. We tend to inherit our political values from our parents. Although there is, I think, in some ways, right, a little bit of a counter trend these days, because we know that increasingly older Americans tend to lean conservative, and younger Americans tend to lean more liberal. So there may be some sort of shifting on that issue. There may be a growing number of young people who are in some ways rejecting their parents' political values, but still mostly we essentially inherit them from our parents. That's a big deal. Well, one's peers, right, as one starts to age and mature, you start to interact with a larger universe of people and not just your immediate family. And the more you interact, right, with your peers and develop friendships and friend groups and so forth, right, they're also going to influence your views on things like politics. So peer influence here is significant. School, right? School has an impact. I would say probably especially K through 12, and to a lesser degree, I think, higher education. Because really, right, by the time one goes to an institution of higher education, if they do, they're typically at least 18 years old. Their political views are pretty set. So I've always been deeply unconvinced that higher ed has a strong impact on one's public opinion on political issues. But it probably has some, right? The data do tend to suggest that the more generally speaking, it's complicated by issues like race and gender, but generally, the more education you have beyond high school, the more likely you are to lean in a somewhat more liberal direction. But yeah, K through 12 for sure has a big impact, and right, often that education K through 12 is sort of kind of a patriotic, right, education. That tends to promote sort of loyalty to country and so forth. So school makes a difference, although I don't think as much as either family or peers. And then finally, the media, right? The various manifestations of the media, whether that's television, movies, radio, especially talk radio, social media like Instagram and Facebook, newspapers, cable television, whether it's CNN or Fox News or it's the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or whatever, right, that has some influence on public opinion as well. I tend to think not the huge impact that some seem to give it, but I think it makes some difference to public opinion. So these are some of the key influences that influence the nature of public opinion. All right, so we know that public opinion matters in a democracy. We saw some great examples throughout American history of elected leaders recognizing that and trying to shape it in their preferred direction. So that's one thing, right, to talk about. But another thing is, how do we know what public opinion is on a mass scale? How do we know what the American public is thinking about abortion, affirmative action, who they're going to vote for in the next election? Right? How do we know that? Well, we don't know it perfectly, right? But we can make some very good educated guesses. How do we do that? Public opinion polling. Right? Polling. It's often lambasted by critics, and some of that's deserved, but it's the best thing we have, right? What other alternatives do we have to figuring out mass public opinion? There are no alternatives. And what are you going to do? I talk to my friends, and this is what they think, therefore that's what America thinks? Well, that's ridiculous. I just have a feel that this is how Americans think. Well, what do you mean you have a feel? We need data, right? As a political scientist, we need data to support claims about what is public opinion. And polling is the best we have. It's far from perfect, but it's the best we have. All right. So how do you go about doing a good poll on either an election or an issue? It's called random sampling or probability sampling, as our text identifies it. Right? You try to randomly choose people across the country so that there's no biases, right? You don't want too many men or too many women or too many white people or too many Latinos or too many people of the Jewish faith or the Catholic faith. You want to get a random sampling, right, that represents a cross, what would you call that? Damn it, I can't remember what it's called. But yeah, you want a good sample of the diversity of America. Best way to do that is make it a random process. So everyone's got the same probability of being selected for a poll. You typically need around 1,000 respondents for a quality result. Some polling firms will go a little lower. If you go lower, you have more error probability. And if you go a little higher, you get a little more accurate, but not a lot more accurate. And the higher you go, the more expensive it is. And let me say something about that too quickly. It is oh shoot, what was I going to say? That it can be quite costly to sample a lot of people, because increasingly people don't answer their cell phones. So pollsters have really struggled with this low response rate. They're trying to figure out ways around it. All right. So random sampling, it's very challenging to do. Right? Low response rates make it extra challenging. It's a tough field to be in these days. Issue of error, right? No matter how good your polling techniques are, you're going to have error in your final results, right? You just are. And typically with a good sample of about 1,000 respondents, although typically with cell phone calling, you might need to call 20,000 numbers to get 1,000 responses, right? That's pretty typical. Typically you're talking plus or minus 3%, right? So let's say you're doing an election poll and you have it as candidate A 48%, candidate B 46%, right? You could say 48, 46, and the rest are undecided. But what you can really say is typically I'm 95% certain that this is correct, so not 100, but 95%, and plus or minus 3%, right? So candidate A at 48% could be as high as 51 or as low as 45. Candidate B could be as high as 49 or as low as 43, right? Plus or minus 3% for both candidates. So you have to be careful when you're interpreting polling data with an election. They're giving you a window of probability. They're not giving you exact numbers, right? The top line of that poll will be an exact number, 48, 46. But in the fine print, right, it's going to be much more akin to a window, right? Plus or minus 3% for both candidates, i.e., they're not as accurate as you might think. Right? And it helps to explain why sometimes they're not super accurate, because they're giving you a window. They're giving you a window. It's very, very challenging to do this. Election polls. Something to say about that. You're really right? Trying to only sample those who are actually going to vote. You don't want to be sampling people who say they're going to vote but don't. So you're trying to figure that out, right, when you're doing an election poll. I only want to get responses from people who are actually going to vote. Can you ever be sure of that? No, you can never be sure, right? You're trying to predict a future behavior. They may tell you that they're going to vote, but they don't. They may tell you that they're interested in this election, but they're not. They may tell you that they have a plan for voting, but they may not. Or they may intend to vote, right, but then something comes up and they don't. Very challenging, very difficult. Because you don't want to get responses from people who don't end up voting. That messes up your election poll. Just want to give you a feel for the methodological challenges of election polling. Another thing about election polling to note here is you do have at least, right, a standard against which to measure the quality of your work, right? If you predict end of the election season that candidate A is going to win by 3 points, we can test that, right, by the actual result. So we have a standard to measure the quality of election polling, the final result. Is it close to what you had predicted? That's the beauty of election polling. And that's why typically with election polling, you don't need to know who's sponsoring the poll necessarily, right, because their generic incentive is to be accurate. Because if you're consistently inaccurate with your predictions about an election result, you lose credibility, right? You lose those who are going to take your poll seriously anymore. Now, that being said, do we have some evidence that some of the more partisan election polling firms lean one way or the other, even though it means they're going to be less accurate? Some evidence of that. You got to be a little bit careful here. But generally, there's a standard against which we can measure these to figure out which ones are reliable and which ones are not. And then there's issue polling, which is much trickier, right? With issue polling, do you support or oppose abortion? Do you support or oppose the death penalty or affirmative action? On those sorts of issues, right, you don't have a way to check the accuracy of those numbers, of that data, right? You really don't. So issue polling can be a little more sort of caveat emptor for the consumer. Because oftentimes issue polling might be done by an advocacy group that's trying to promote either access to abortion or limits on abortion, right? They may be pro-affirmative action or anti-affirmative action. They might be pro-death penalty or anti-death penalty. So they might do issue polling, right, to figure out where the American public is on some of these issues, but they may ask the questions in a way that's designed to lead the respondent to a certain outcome. You may say, do you support affirmative action given that it's an effort to create a more level playing field for everybody? Right? If you ask it that way, a lot of people are going to go, yes, I support that affirmative action. Heck yes, I want an equal playing field for everybody. That's one way to think about it, right? Or if you're against affirmative action, your group is against affirmative action, you may say, do you support affirmative action given that it means discriminating against various groups based on their race? People are going to say, no, I can't stand affirmative action. I hate that stuff. Discrimination. Terrible. But you also might think of affirmative action in that way, right? So you got to be a little bit careful when you're looking at issue polling. Who's sponsoring the poll? Is it an advocacy group? And if it is, did they use fair wording? Was their wording relatively neutral? Right? Or are they leading the respondent to give a certain response? So there you really do want to know who's sponsoring the poll, and you want to look at how they worded the questions. All right, so what are some demographic factors that shape public opinion? Because it turns out, and I call this hidden brain stuff, riffing off of a podcast on public radio. This is hidden brain stuff, right? Because I think we all like to think of ourselves as freely choosing individuals who arrive at our own conclusions regarding opinion on certain issues, right? Well, it turns out that's not entirely true, right? We're not as free as we think we are. We're being shaped by hidden brain factors like our racial identity, our gender identity, the geographies where we live, and our socioeconomic status, right? These are all larger factors that shape individuals' views on issues. The data show that super clearly, right? It's a real thing. A lot of people push back against that, right? Especially if you're not a social scientist. You go, no, I have these views because these are my own unique individual views. And, to some extent that's true. But to some extent, right, that's not really quite true. We are freely choosing individuals, but we're being shaped by these larger factors that we don't even typically think much about. All right. So, check out our text on the issue of race, right? Does race and racial identity influence how we think about politics? Yes. Yes. The answer is yes. On issues like the death penalty, okay, gun control. Is racism still significant in American society? What about policing issues? Does your racial identity have a big impact on how you think about these things? Heck yes. Heck yes, right? If you're white, you're more likely to support the death penalty. If you're black or Latino, you're more likely to oppose it. If you're white, you're more likely to oppose gun control. If you're an American of color, you're more likely to support various forms of gun control. If you're white in America, you're more likely to think that racism is no longer a factor in American life. And if you're a person of color, you're more likely to think that, no, racism is still pretty significant in our society. It's like we're living in separate societies almost. I remember the Kerner Commission from back in the 60s, trying to figure out why we were having rioting in America's big cities after the Civil Rights Movement. Right? And they said, hey, look, Americans, black and white, essentially live in two different geographies, and they have different experiences based on racial identity. Some would say the data today still supports some version of that Kerner Commission conclusion. Policing, right? Whites tend to think, hey, policing's going great in America. It's all good. Right? And from their point of view, that's probably true, right? But if you're black in America, you're more likely to go, well, you know what? Policing is complicated, right? So sometimes it's great and super effective, and sometimes it breaks down and it's abusive. All right, so we know then from the data, there are some pretty significant racial gaps on these issues. And if you're white in America, right, you're more likely to vote Republican. And if you're a person of color, you're much more likely to vote Democratic. Big differences there. Racial identity matters, it just does. Gender. Gender doesn't matter as much. Here we're talking about kind of the basic men-women thing. Not as big a factor as race for sure, but it still matters. It still influences public opinion. Men tend to be more supportive of Donald Trump, more supportive of Republican candidates, more conservative. Women tend to be less supportive of Donald Trump, less Republican, less conservative, generally speaking. The gaps are not huge, but they're significant. They matter. All right, so gender matters in those ways. Socioeconomic status, although this quickly gets super complicated, and this is not a course on sociology or an upper-level course on political science, so I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. In general, right, the higher your education, the higher your income, the more prestigious your occupation, tends to make you more Republican, a bit more conservative. If you have lower levels of education, lower income, and a less prestigious occupation, you tend to be a Democratic, tend to vote Democratic. But race can complicate that narrative. And in the age of Trump, even more so. Right? Because what's been happening in recent election cycles, increasingly, you're getting the white working class, right, who increasingly are voting for Donald Trump and similar candidates, right, arguably based on racial factors and not on questions about education or occupation. So that's been, in some ways, right, some of the genius of Donald Trump has been his ability to disrupt the standard narrative that if you have a lower level of education and are lower on the occupational hierarchy, you're more likely to vote Democratic, right? He's gotten whites with limited education and low occupational prestige to vote Republican. That's been one of the secrets to some of his success when he's had success. So race can complicate some of these more standard narratives about socioeconomic status and your politics. And then finally, geography matters. This will shock no one. Americans who live in urban areas tend to be Democratic, tend to vote for Democrats. That hardly needs emphasis. Those living in rural areas and small towns tend to be Republican, and the suburbs can be pretty divided, pretty 50-50. A lot of our political battles these days are in some ways fought in suburban geographies to determine who's going to win an election. And I would say there too, right, we don't want to paint with too broad a brush. What kind of suburb are you talking about? Let's use Las Vegas as an example. Are you talking about the Near East Side, Sunrise Manor, right, directly adjacent to downtown Las Vegas, leaning towards North Las Vegas? That's a suburb, right, but it's an older suburb. It's a close-in inner ring suburb, and there's a lot, right, a lot of people of color living in Sunrise Manor, particularly Latinos who tend, and in this case, working class Latinos, right? So Sunrise Manor is a suburb, but it tends to be, Democratic pretty heavily. And then you got, right, what are known as outer ring, newer, or even island suburbs. Places like Lake Las Vegas or Anthem or big chunks of Summerlin, right? They're also suburbs, but they're way different than Sunrise Manor, right? They're much newer, much more affluent, much whiter, and they tend to be more distant from the inner city. They tend to be Republican, right? So with suburbs, I think if you aggregate all the suburbs in America, it's pretty 50-50, Democrat, Republican, but you do see some patterns within that broad narrative. What kind of suburb is it, right? If it's this kind, it's going to be more Democratic. If it's that kind, it's going to be more Republican. To finish things up with public opinion, we're going to look at the dark side here. What are some issues that we should keep in mind? One, right, the American public can be woefully uninformed about things. What was it Jefferson said? The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Right? So if Jefferson was correct, we might be in some trouble. Because we know that the average American is not terribly well informed about critical issues in our politics. Right? And when you have relatively uninformed citizens, right, that leaves we the people somewhat more vulnerable to cynical demagogues who can take advantage of that lack of knowledge to sell a certain agenda. So that can be problematic, right? Clearly, a quality democracy depends to some extent on we the people being reasonably well informed about most issues, and we don't always seem to have that. Right? So that can be problematic. And what was it? I think it was Churchill who said, "Democracy is the worst possible form of governance, with the exception of all the other forms, which are even worse." Right? Kind of a backhanded compliment to democracy. It's very flawed. We see it here, right? But it's the best we have. The alternatives are definitely worse. The American public can be misinformed by cynical media platforms increasingly, right? Dare I say, Fox News, that sold these falsehoods about a stolen election in 2020, right? And Fox News has come to regret that, right? Because we know from behind-the-scenes emails and texts that hosts like Tucker Carlson knew that they were telling lies to their viewership, but they told them anyway because they were worried that if they didn't lie to their viewers would shift to more conservative media that would tell them those lies, like One American News Network or Newsmax, right? They were concerned about the share price of Fox News. Well, guess what? Right? They recently had to settle with Dominion Voting Systems, one of the private companies they smeared as having thrown the election to Biden, falsely claiming that, for almost $800 million, right? And they have another one coming up, Smartmatic, same basic dealio. We'll see how that one goes. But Fox News is on the hook for a lot of money, right? Because they've libeled and defamed and slandered private companies, and then they did so telling knowing falsehoods, right? And Donald Trump, right? Even if one supports him, right, one recognizes, boy, he lies a lot. He tells a lot of lies, like the 2020 election. Now, you might like that, right? One might like the lies that he tells because they're fun or whatever. But, you know, lies are lies. So, right, and a lot of people take him seriously. And that's problematic, right? Because I think a quality democracy depends upon we the people being informed, and being informed of basic facts, and not accepting lies and falsehoods as a substitute for the truth. So that's problematic, right, about public opinion, especially in the age of the internet and the endless flow of information with very little editorial control. It's created problems for our democracy, right? That in some way, I remember the early days of the internet where in political science we were like, this is going to be great. It's going to be the free flow of information. We're living in the age of information. That's going to be good for our democracy. It has not proven to be good for our democracy. It's been quite toxic. Lots of lies and falsehoods and manipulations. It's a mess. It's a toxic mess. So that's problematic about our democracy and public opinion. And then finally, I would just say this is not really the dark side per se, but I think all elected leaders need to figure out, right, when should they lead public opinion, right? Like say, okay, so the public currently doesn't support civil rights legislation, but I'm going to try to convince the public that they should support that, right? Lincoln saying, oh, well, right now the people don't think of the Civil War as a battle over slavery, but I need to change that because I think that's the core motive behind the Civil War is the issue of slavery and its abolition. Right, so there are times, for sure there are times, when leaders, I think, have a responsibility to lead public opinion, right, try to get the public on their side. They may or may not succeed, but they have every right to try. Right, and on the other hand, don't we also expect our elected leaders to sometimes follow public opinion, right? To do that which is popular, because that's what you want in some ways, right? In a democracy, is that ultimate power should reside among we the people. And if we the people want X and such a policy, right? Mostly they should probably get that because that's a defining characteristic of a democracy. It's always a tricky thing for elected leaders, right? When do we lead public opinion? Essentially say, right, I disagree with what the public thinks. I'm going to try to change that. I may or may not succeed. And when do you say, you know, like, I don't really agree with what the public wants, but it's their democracy and they're in the majority and maybe I should give them what they want, right? I think both of those ways of thinking about it are legitimate, right? Sometimes I think elected leaders should lead public opinion to the best of their ability. Other times they should follow the public and do what the public wants, the majority. Tricky balance, right? Tricky balance. And each leader has their own sort of special formula for how they do that. Bill Clinton was known as someone who mostly let the public lead him in terms of what he should do as president. He tended to follow public opinion. And there's a case for that. And then others like George W. Bush, right? He tended to try to lead public opinion and essentially reject what the public wanted and go a different direction. And both of those can be legitimate ways that elected leaders deal with public opinion.